Hi everyone, welcome to lecture 10. We're going to be talking about endocrine system. This is one of the more interesting systems in the body, and when you're studying physiology, understanding endocrine is a really important way to understand a lot of the different feedback mechanisms and a lot of the different pathways and how our body responds to different conditions. Endocrine system is one of the more important communication systems in the body. And we're going to talk in general about this. This here is a picture of pancreas, and we're looking. Pancreas is an interesting organ in that it has both exocrine and endocrine secretion function. So it works as a gland both in an exocrine and endocrine way. The exocrine part is most of this slide, and that's focusing on digestive enzymes primarily. It helps secrete digestive enzymes into the digestive tract. That's why it's called exocrine, because it's going out of the body. You may think, well, wait, my intestines aren't out of my body. But if you think about the actual, like, what's in the intestines and how it got there, it's things that are in your intestines got there without ever having to cross over cell membranes or body tissues. Just went in your mouth, and it's basically a tube all the way through. So it's technically kind of outside of your body. So that's why this part's called exocrine. But we're focusing on endocrine, which means into the body. And the structure here is referred to as a pancreatic islet, ISLET. So we will come back and talk about those towards the end of the lecture today. Endocrine system is a collection of glands that regulate the activity of target organs. So like I said, it's a communication system. It's a way of sending out a message to the body. And this is a way of sending out a message to the whole body because the endocrine system is sending hormones into the blood and through the blood. So that's the hallmark of endocrine, is it's traveling through the blood. So it's sending hormones, these chemical messengers. That means that everywhere that blood glows in your body, those hormones are going too. So every cell in your body that has blood, which is going to be everything, has the potential to respond to those hormones. But in order to have a response, that target has to have a receptor for that. We've talked about receptors before. And so we talked about this basic concept of specificity, how the hormone, in order for it to have an effect on a target, that target has to know that the hormone is there. In the same way that I sort of consider this kind of like a radio. Like if you have a radio in your car, the radio station might be sending out the signal, and they are kind of all the time, right? But you have to have first of all, you have to have a radio in your car to hear that. And secondly, you have to have the radio even tuned to the right frequency. And if you do, then you can hear the message and you'll get that message. But if you don't have a radio or you don't have it turned on or tuned to that, then you're not going to get the message. In the same way that a target cell, that message might be going out to the entire body, but the target cell has to have that receptor, that's like the radio, to be able to hear the message and then respond to that. Hormones are great at long-term or ongoing functions, things that might be slower, or if it's something that maybe is still pretty fast, but doesn't have to be instant. And so we'll talk about, for example, epinephrine in the fight or flight response. Some of that's neurological, but then also epinephrine is involved at a hormone level, so kind of keep a little longer term response. They're great at low concentrations. You don't need very much hormone to make a difference. And then, of course, removal in the ways that most things are removed by liver and kidneys. And so, once a hormone goes out there, then there's going to be some gradual decay. And so to keep the message of that, the hormone must keep getting produced if you want that message to continue getting made. And a lot of them are subject to feedback loops, where as the hormone gets produced, it goes back and controls the signals that were causing the hormone to get reduced. So a lot of these negative feedback loops, and we're going to talk a lot about that today. Different kinds of hormones exist. The three major kinds that we talk about. We have amino acid derived hormones. These are produced from a single amino acid. So for example, we can see here, some of them are derived from tyrosine, is a very common one. There's tryptophan, there's other hormones that get involved. But here we see the structure of tyrosine, and then here we see next to it the structure of epinephrine. So chemically quite similar, some changes, obviously, to make them a different thing. These typically cannot cross the cell membrane very easily, and so they are going to have receptors on the cell surface primarily, but some of them can cross or have ways to get in, and so there can be intracellular receptors for them as well. Peptide and protein hormones are composed of chains of amino acids. And so in the case of insulin, I don't remember exactly how long insulin is. I think it's 80 some, like 81 amino acids. That number is, I'm just kind of pulling that out of my head. I don't remember exactly, but kind of give you an idea. It's 81 amino acids in a chain, so it's a polypeptide. And this is definitely not going to be able to go through the cell membrane, so its receptor has to be on the cell surface, like we've talked about in previous lectures. And then steroid hormones are derived from cholesterol. So here's cholesterol, and then here is estradiol, which is a steroid hormone version of estrogen. Estrogen is kind of a class. It's not just a single molecule. There's different kinds of estrogen, just like there's different kinds of androgens, like testosterone. And these typically can go directly into cells because they have no trouble crossing through membranes, and so they will bind to intracellular receptors, but they're hydrophobic enough that sometimes they have trouble being in the aqueous solution of blood, and so they can attach to certain proteins like albumins that are helpful to help hydrophobic things travel in the blood. The major center for control of the endocrine system is the hypothalamus. So it's this little part of the brain just above the pituitary gland, and that's what this is. This is the pituitary, where basically it's the interface between brain and endocrine, nervous system and endocrine system. And a lot of times the way the hypothalamus works, there's two major ways it works. One is it will release these kinds of control hormones. And so the pituitary gland you can think of as an extension of the hypothalamus in a way. One way it works is the hypothalamus will send hormones through the blood down to the anterior pituitary through a system called the hypophyseal. Hypophyseal just is another fancy name, like the hypophysis is another name for the pituitary. So you'll see that word sometimes. Hypophyseal just means pituitary. Portal system is a network of blood vessels that connect the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus. Now you might remember hearing about this in anatomy, or more likely you remember hearing about the hepatic portal system. And a portal system is an interesting thing. It's where normally in the body, when we think of blood vessels, we think of arteries basically branching and branching and getting smaller and smaller until they get down to capillaries. And then capillaries kind of getting bigger and bigger as they turn into veins, right? So we normally think of this system of like the arterial side goes smaller and smaller and smaller. Once you get to a capillary bed, then it comes bigger and bigger and bigger as it heads back to the heart, right? That's sort of the normal way we think of blood vessels. A portal system is not totally off of that, but it does something in the middle. So it does the thing like our arteries get smaller and smaller and smaller, and we see this happening. Just hit my microphone, sorry. We see that happening here. So the arteries coming in, branching and getting smaller and smaller into this capillary network. And then they come back together again. They start getting bigger back into veins. But instead of just collecting bigger and bigger, they go to another place and then they branch out into smaller and smaller capillaries again. So that's the same thing that happens in the hepatic portal system, right? It's capillary beds in the intestines, comes up into bigger veins to the liver, and then branches back out into capillaries again in the liver. So that's kind of what this portal system is. It's like a connection between two different capillary beds. And these are the two major places that I think of portal systems in the body. One is the liver, is that really big one. And then this one is the hypophyseal portal system. So what's happening here is the hypothalamus is putting some hormones into the blood up here. Those hormones travel through the portal system down to the anterior pituitary, and then they branch back out again, so the anterior pituitary is going to get the message really well. And then the anterior pituitary is going to make hormones of its own, and it's going to send that out to the rest of the body. So the main message of this is coming from the anterior pituitary gland, but it's the hypothalamus that's telling the anterior pituitary what to do. And it does so by sending out releasing hormones that are going to stimulate secretion of hormones from the anterior pituitary. And then the opposite, there are inhibiting hormones that will stop the release of those hormones from the anterior pituitary. The other way, let's see, do we have that next picture? Yeah. The other way that the hypothalamus is involved through the pituitary is the posterior pituitary. The anterior and posterior pituitary happen to be in the same place, but they are absolutely completely different glands. They do different things. They're made of different things. They just happen to be right next to each other in part of this same structure hanging down. But they are completely different glands. And in fact, the posterior pituitary is almost not really even its own gland. It is, but what happens is it's actually neurons that start in the hypothalamus. They send their axons down into the posterior pituitary, and it's here that the posterior pituitary is going to connect with the blood vessels. And so what ends up happening is the hormones are actually made up here in the posterior pituitary. They travel down through these neurons and get released out into the blood. You might remember hearing about neurohormones. Neurohormones, this idea that these are hormones being released by neurons. So almost like the way a neuron typically will release neurotransmitters to cross over to the next cell, it's the same kind of a thing, except instead of a next cell, it's releasing into the bloodstream. So it becomes a hormone, not a neurotransmitter. Right? The difference between a hormone and a neurotransmitter is 100% due to how far it goes before its target cell. Right? A lot of times it can even be the same molecules. Like for example, norepinephrine is both a neurotransmitter and a hormone. And it just has to do with like, is it going from one cell to another, or is it getting released into the bloodstream? Same chemical, two different things, because it has to do with how it's functioning. So these are technically hormones, even though they're coming from neurons, because they are being released into bloodstream. Notice that the posterior pituitary is not making any of its own hormones. It's basically just an extension of the hypothalamus, is kind of the best way to think about the posterior. Anterior is glandular tissue and is its own thing. Just it's controlled by the hypothalamus. There are two hormones released by the posterior pituitary, and this is the only time we're going to talk about them today, or at least in this lecture. Antidiuretic hormone, that is also abbreviated ADH, which can sometimes be confused with alcohol dehydrogenase, which is another ADH that people talk about, how our bodies break down alcohol. Antidiuretic hormone has nothing to do with that other ADH. Its job is to increase water reabsorption in the kidneys, and we'll talk about that when we get to renal function, where that happens, primarily in the collecting duct of the kidney. And so its job is to basically increase water reabsorption, so help the body retain water. And if you look at its name, you'll know that, right? Antidiuretic. A diuretic is something that makes more urine. So if somebody's on a diuretic, it's to help them urinate more. Like there are a lot of, like caffeine is a diuretic, so when you drink coffee, you're more likely to have to go to the bathroom. Antidiuretic is going to do the opposite. It's going to like make it so that there's less urine. And this is a hormone, so it functions at the kidneys. The other one is oxytocin. Oxytocin is kind of a bonding hormone. And so here it talks about its specific use in pregnancy and especially in delivery. But that's, a very specialized use of it. An important one, of course, but it's also found in everybody all the time. And is increased especially during like a hug or like some kind of like a deep personal connection with somebody. Its function in labor and delivery is that it will stimulate contractions of the uterus during labor and milk ejection during breastfeeding. So it's also part of creating that bond during breastfeeding that both the baby and the mother feel. There's a lot of people do talk about that. I know breastfeeding can be stressful for some, so it doesn't happen to everybody. But like for most people, when they actually do that, there's a way in which there's this can be this really sweet connection between mother and child in that moment. And oxytocin is a big part of that. There is a drug called Pitocin that is often given to women in labor to help basically stimulate birth. So it helps stimulate the delivery process. And it's basically a drug form of this natural hormone. And Dr. Bipal put this cute little thing in there. I'm only letting you hug me for the oxytocin, right? So just a reminder, oxytocin makes you feel bonded and connected to somebody when there's, some connection like that, like a hug. All right, I'm going to stop here before we get into anterior pituitary.